Listeners, welcome. This is the final episode of Series 2 of the podcast. It feels like just yesterday that I joined the podcast team at the start of this series, but since then we've produced 9 episodes with alumni around the world. Geoff, do you have any reflections on Series 2?
Other than how interesting life continues to be to me, talking to so many people who do so many different things, it is absolutely fascinating. It's been a very hectic year for me in the day job, as it has, I know, for a lot of people at Aston and beyond. And I don't know how it's been for the listeners, but the pod has been kind of a little oasis of calm. And hearing so many different views and different opinions has helped put lots of different things in perspective. So I've really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. We've had some brilliant guests, and we are going to end with a bang for this series. So today we are joined by the fantastic Kevin Alderson, Kev, and we're going to be talking about all things performance marketing. Geoff, what can you tell us about Kev?
Okay, deep breath. Kevin is a global marketing leader with nearly 2 decades of experience across business to consumer and business to business brands in software as a service, technology, retail, travel, and gaming. A proud Aston graduate, Kevin completed his BSc in marketing in 2005 and has since gone on to lead performance marketing at an extraordinary scale. Most recently, Kevin was Vice President of Global Performance Marketing at Sage, where he led teams of 60 plus specialists, managed £70 million plus in annual investment across multiple regions, and drove commercial growth across more than 25 product portfolios. Known for combining data-driven decision-making with intuition, empathy, and strong leadership, Kevin is now co-founder and managing partner of Honeybee Group, an independent consultancy helping business-to-business organizations achieve sustainable long-term growth through performance marketing that actually works. Kevin, now's the time to tell me if I've got all of that right. Welcome to the After Aston I podcast.
Thank you, Geoff, and thank you, Aimee. It's a real pleasure to come along and chat to you and the audience today. What a lovely introduction. Thank you for that.
Something I've always meant to ask before we launch into the questions. When you hear your life's work, your career to date rolled out like that, do you have a moment where you go, wow, I did all that? Or is it more of a kind of, actually, there's so much more beneath the surface?
I'm actually a natural introvert. So being the center of attention and having my career positioned as in the way you just did actually makes me incredibly uncomfortable, to be honest. I'm far happier talking about the mechanics of my role and the peripheral aspects of it. Talking about myself is not something that comes particularly naturally to me, but I will try my best to get on board with that. It is quite nice to reflect on it occasionally because you don't tend to think about it. You look ahead rather than behind. And I certainly think I've come a long way since 2005 when I left Aston.
Amazing. Well, hopefully we'll get you slightly more into the comfort zone here. If you had to explain your career to somebody who was a non-marketer in just 1 minute, I'll put a time limit on it, how would you describe what you actually do?
I actually have to do this quite often with friends and family, and judging by the recent Christmas period where there was a lot of socializing and also a lot of blank looks when I was having this conversation, I'm probably not that good at explaining it, but I think the easiest starting point is advertising. So I help businesses figure out how to best invest their advertising budgets to help deliver long-term sustainable success against their target objectives. So it's about balancing investment, building brand awareness with potential customers who are not yet ready to buy, alongside capturing in-market demand from potential customers who they are ready to buy. And my role has changed quite a lot over the years, so the explanation behind it has evolved as I go. So I've gone from a technical role, kind of at the coalface, so to speak, to a leadership role, managing lots of people and budget, and now as a strategic consultant, which is probably the easiest one to explain of the three.
So tell us a bit more about that strategic consultancy side of things. What's the difference now from kind of technical to people to strategic?
Yeah, I mean, they're all linked in some way, but the strategic consultancy, I mentioned long-term sustainable success, and really that's what strategy is there to deliver. In technical roles and in roles where I've been in corporate organizations with short-term targets, the focus is on hitting the number. It's, your target for this quarter, this half, this year is X. How are you going to get us to that point? The difference now with the consultancy is I take a broader, more holistic view of clients and try and embed practices, particularly in B2B, the area that I work, where you have longer sales cycles, larger average order values. It's more about how we can work with the 95% of prospects who are not in the market today, as well as capture that demand from the 5% who are. So it's more of a longer term process than it is about a short term activation.
Do you find that the majority of clients, presumably having chosen to work with you and knowing the reputation, are kind of okay with overlooking those kind of occasional short-term factors? Or do you still encounter some people who bring you in and then suddenly they're all back to the immediate numbers and thinking, come on, let's do this quickly?
Yeah, no, we certainly don't avoid the short-term performance. Without short-term performance, there is no long-term performance. So we try and do both in parallel. I think with a lot of the organizations that we go in to work with, on day one, their focus is almost exclusively on the short term. And we just want to dilute that slightly by elevating their thinking to be, yes, we know the value, we know the importance to your line managers and stakeholders and board members to hit those short-term targets. It greases the wheels to get you where you need to be. But if there isn't a parallel component that looks at long-term performance, you end up getting to a position where it's an ever decreasing circle. You're not being able to generate the scale that you need by just targeting in-market prospects. You have to do the foundational work. You have to build the awareness. You have to be present when people are putting shortlists together. Because if you're not, and you're just turning up in the latter stages of a decision-making process, the chance to integrate yourself into that process is greatly reduced by only having that short-term presence.
And what exactly, because I used the phrase performance marketing during the introduction, and I'm not from that world at all. And it's one of those, I hear the words and I immediately conjure up an image in my head of what it is, but maybe I'm completely wrong. How would you define performance marketing? What's the purpose? What's the goal? What are the mechanics?
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of contrasting definitions of performance marketing. The main thing from my perspective, before I touch on the definition side of things, is that we look at all marketing activity holistically, not just create labels for sub-functions of marketing. I think that's how you create silos in organizations, particularly some of the larger organizations that I work with. That there's no communication, there's no transparency or coordination between certain parts of the marketing function that really should be working together in the closest possible way. I am showing my age a little bit, but I started to work in performance marketing before it was even called that, before it had a name. But when it did start to be used a little more commonly, it tended to be linked to channels where you had clear data points. So on that basis, it first started getting commonly applied to digital channels where you could connect spend to a result relatively easily, and whether that was a lead or a sale, essentially direct response tactics. And I think that's where the performance marketing definition really began, and probably about where it remains broadly today. It's things that you can measure, but with cookie deprecation, with multi-channel attribution, with cross-device conversion, it's far more difficult to attach a definitive ROI or CPL to a particular marketing tactic because there's so many moving parts. So it's probably evolving as a definition as we go. But for me, like I said at the start of this particular question, we need to look at marketing in the broadest possible way to understand how everything works together and what that performance delivers.
So, coming from a marketing background myself, a lot of the terminology that we're using today is quite familiar to me. So, B2B being business to business, when we talk about conversion rates and so on. We're also talking about cookies without going into all of the detail about it. For our listeners who may be less familiar with the day-to-day marketing technical jargon, we're not talking about chocolate chip cookies here, are we?
No, we're not. Unfortunately, we're not. I would probably prefer to be talking about chocolate chip cookies. I'm a big fan. But from a cookie perspective, yes. So essentially, it's the the visibility of traffic that's going to a certain site. So if you click on a cookie banner, which we'll all be familiar with from landing on websites, you can accept cookies, you can reject cookies, or you can configure which cookies are recorded about you. And from an advertising perspective, if someone rejects the advertising cookies, what we can see in terms of their ongoing interaction with the website or ultimately conversion for a lead or a sale, we lose that visibility completely. So it's a factor to bake in to our reporting, to our performance reporting, to understand that yes, we may have a lower ROI, return on investment, that we would like to have, but that's probably because we can only see 20 or 30% of the actual traffic that's coming to the site.
Great. And I suppose what I'm curious about is the ongoing forever debate of whether marketing is creative and an art or whether it's a science. And what I'm hearing from you is a lot about data. So I wonder where you fall on that debate, art or science.
Oh, it's a good question. Actually chose the degree at Aston. I did a marketing degree at Aston, and I chose it specifically because it was a Bachelor of Science degree. I wanted to be more involved in the data side, the kind of the economics of marketing, the passing of data between platforms, which was all quite early stage when I first did my degree back in the early 2000s. I don't think there was a single digital marketing module in the entire 4-year course, but it very quickly evolved into an area that was heavily led by the numbers. And I've always stayed on that side since that point. Just because I've worked there and that's my preference doesn't mean marketing is or isn't an art. I think it's a combination of the two. In reality, what we do with the data can only be achieved if the creative is impactful enough and the messaging is engaging enough. So I do think it straddles both quite neatly, but certainly in terms of my preference and my background, it's always been on the science side of the argument.
On LinkedIn, you've mentioned that you use data, but you leave room for intuition. How do you balance the two? Can you, off the top of your head, do you have any examples where the data might have said one thing and your instinct has said another, or do they normally line up pretty straight?
I think the first thing you need to accept in marketing or performance marketing is that you're not going to get every decision right. And that's absolutely fine. Data tells you what's happening, but it does lack the context and the nuance that comes with experience or intuition. So past campaign performance or even a general gut feel are to be welcomed. Or we may as well pass the keys over to an automated process and turn the lights out on the way out. So a good recent example is I had a client who was very insistent that activity in the Nordics, we were covering Norway, Sweden, and Finland activation for them. They said August is off the table. The performance will be nothing. Everyone is on holiday. No one is interested in B2B software at that point in the year. Any campaign investment would be wasted. And the data said as much, but it felt unsubstantiated. It was a leading indicator in the sense that performance was poor in the past because they'd turned it off or turned it down to a very low level. So what we did, we ring-fenced spend from a testing pot, rolled out a low-level campaign in Norway, and we immediately started to see conversions come in at the most efficient cost per lead we'd seen at any point during the year. So we expanded this very quickly. The data was strong. And while the overall volume was lower, the conversions that we did generate, which otherwise would have fell directly into a competitor's lap, I think they were about 30% cheaper than any other month in the year. So it was, that was driven by just a feeling that maybe we were being a bit too hasty in terms of turning this off.
And you've managed some very, very large budgets for these types of projects. How do you decide in a situation like the one you just mentioned, for example, how do you decide when to double down or when to pull back? Is it all numbers based, or are you always looking over the hill as well?
Yeah, I mean, the data drives a lot of that conversation, as does seasonality. The B2B has some very sharp peaks and troughs depending on who you're working with, and I think that has to feed into how you would phase a budget over the course of a year. A lot of the platforms that we work in, Google Ads, for example, will give you an indicator of the coverage that you have at any given point in time. So impression share is a metric that tells you the percentage of time you are present in an auction. So if that presence is 50 or 60%, you know you've got 40% headroom to invest more in that area. So if your cost per lead is relatively efficient, if you have the spare budget or you have underperforming channels elsewhere, it's a very clear conversation or action to move budget across to that to capitalize on the remaining coverage that you could potentially get. Beyond that, I think it becomes more of a conversation around the specific part of the funnel that you need to drive activity in. So, like I mentioned earlier, if we're just targeting direct response demand gen activity, there will be a ceiling where you hit the point of diminishing returns, and any additional investment will bring in more leads, but there will be a less efficient level. So that's when you look at other parts of the funnel where you have different KPIs and different actions that you consider to be important to help build a pipeline for the future. And in B2B, that's hugely important that you have that steady pipeline, that predictable flow of leads that are coming through the system.
Many of us here at Aston have been through data analytics training over the past few months. And what I'm hearing from you kind of echoes what came through a lot of that training, which is around the power of contextualization and understanding not just what the numbers say, but also everything else that's going on around them to make that number make sense. I'm curious, how do you keep on top of all of the industry trends? What are the things that you do to make sure that that experience that you've got and that intuition balances out with the leading and the lagging indicators and the data?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's one of the first things that when your workload gets to a critical point, it tends to drop off the list. I think it's very easy to say, oh, I spend a lot of time reading and I utilize AI in various different ways to give me summaries of changing trends and trajectories in platforms. But ultimately, if I'm at a point during a month or a week where my workload is at its peak, that's the type of activity that I just don't have the time to be able to deliver. But ultimately, it's what gives you the edge in terms of working with clients and being able to add value to them in terms of progressive testing and proactively recommending changes to their approach. So I try and build in pockets in my diary where it is dedicated towards that kind of learning phase. I think it's one of the biggest distinctions that I've noticed from working in a corporate environment where you were exposed to external agencies and peer groups and often partners who you would almost organically pick up that information. Working as a consultant in a small team and working with clients who don't necessarily have performance marketing capability, you have to more actively look for that information. You have to mine it. So newsletters are probably the way that I really find out most of my information these days. I sign up to a lot of information that is slightly outside of the boundaries of performance marketing and more leans into it. There's tons of great stuff out there, and I find it's quite a relaxing way to end the day, knowing that I've got half an hour or 45 minutes just to read through some newsletters, turn off my emails, turn off my Teams, and just absorb a little bit of information before I end for the day.
I love the honesty there as well, because we can all look at people on LinkedIn who have these perfect lives and plenty of time to dedicate to learning and reading and 5 a.m. cold showers and all the rest of it. But that honesty of being able to say, okay, sometimes I get busy, sometimes I can't do this, but I've got this routine, it's in my routine, and it gives me that validation at the end of the day that I can just switch off one form of noise in the form of communication and emails and actually keep up to date. And I recognize completely the power of being able to have those strategic conversations with clients. You touched actually in that response on the shift from corporate to being in a smaller team in a consultancy. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the motivation and the journey. What took you to Honeybee Group and why Honeybee?
Well, I'll start with the Honeybee bit. It's not hugely dynamic in terms of the naming, but my elderly Cocker Spaniel She has been with me since I was 25, and she's pottering around somewhere in the vicinity. You can smell her before you hear her these days. But she has a kennel club name, and her kennel club name was Honeybee Charlotte. And this is my dedication to her. She's been with me for an awful long time. Every major milestone in my life has been shared with, or my adult life has been shared with that dog, pretty much. So this is her lasting legacy. So that's the meaning behind it. In terms of why I started Honeybee, it was always in my mind to start my own business one day, but I was so embedded in corporate life that it never really evolved beyond the occasional daydream where I just wanted to think of something completely different to what I was embedded into. The risk was always too great. But as my team grew at Sage, I found myself drifting away from the day-to-day operation. My role became almost exclusively political and people orientated, which for a technical specialist at heart was quite difficult at first, and I did get used to it, but the fun had gone from the job, and we'd reached the end of a major transformation project at Sage. I was lucky enough to have a bonus and some shares that were maturing at the same time, and it gave me a small window of opportunity to roll the dice really on Honeybee. I can't pretend there wasn't moments in the first year where I'd lay awake at night questioning my decision making. But yeah, since then we've gone from strength to strength, and we've got really significant expansion plans for 2026. It can be quite lonely at times operating a small business. I mentioned being an introvert earlier on, so I thought I'd be absolutely fine with it, but at points I've felt isolated. So the team growing, the client list growing has really helped get past that point. And I have absolutely no regrets in terms of giving this a go and seeing the success that we've managed to generate in just over 2 years. It'll be we'll be coming up to 3 years towards September this year. So yeah, we are nicely established at this point.
You've managed in the past some quite large teams. And as you mentioned, that wasn't something you necessarily set out to do in your career. And then when it came along, it took you away from what you might be more enthusiastic about. Any particular lessons along the way about how do you keep high-performing teams motivated when the pressure's on? And perhaps it's not something that you necessarily did set out to do at the start of your career. How do you get the best out of a team?
Yeah, I think building trust is absolutely central to it. When things are going well, it's easy to manage a team regardless of size. But when it gets tough, it takes a collective effort to get back on track. And that's very difficult if you don't have a team that trusts you, not just in terms of making the right decisions, but knowing the team, knowing they can be bold, knowing they'll be supported, even if something doesn't work out, I think is a really important element to have running through a team. Beyond that, it's key to give as much clarity as possible, ensure that everyone in the team understands the strategy, understands the goal, so we're all moving in the same direction. As soon as that team starts to fracture in terms of aiming at different points or having different objectives, it becomes much more difficult to stay together as a unit. And another point, and this does get harder as the team grows, is to accept that you can't keep everyone happy all of the time. One of my biggest early mistakes leading a sizable team was exactly that. Like, as a leader, you're there to make decisions, you're there to steer the ship. Sometimes the decisions you make won't be particularly popular, but you have to commit to a direction and not sit on the fence. That's part of your responsibility and part of your job. So that decisiveness, I think, is really key to being able to develop the team in the right way and make them know that you are making decisions in the right interests of them and the business as a whole.
I love what you're saying there about, and I'm going to use kind of the academic term around it, the psychological safety that you build within the team, that need for people to feel safe to make mistakes, safe to ask questions, to put their hand up and say, I got that wrong and I'm going to learn from it. Thinking about, and Geoff asked a little bit about learning earlier, but what are some of your biggest learnings? You've been through various corporate roles. You've had 2 stints at Sage. You've ducked out and looked at furniture for a little while in between. You've had a number of these different experiences. What are the biggest things you've learned along the way?
I think I've learned an awful lot about myself, and the biggest learning that I had, particularly in the latter few years at Sage, was not to pretend to be someone you're not. I felt, particularly in the early parts of my career, I needed to adopt a certain persona, to behave in a certain way, to kind of adopt the approach that I'd seen from successful senior leaders in the businesses I've been operating in. And it was very tiring to do that. It was very mentally draining to be in a position where you felt like you had to be someone you weren't just to get through a conversation or get through a particular offsite or project or whatever it might be. But I got to the point where we did some training called Insights. You may be familiar with it. And you basically get a color, a leading color, which indicates your preference of how you'd like to be engaged with and how you like to engage with other people. My color is green. It's high empathy. It's very people orientated. It's about being given the time and space to consider a decision rather than being put on the spot. And once I started to realize that I didn't have to change who I was, I just had to adapt my behavior or ask others to adapt their approach to get the best out of each other, then things started to click into place a lot more. And I wouldn't say it was the catalyst or the final step that took me to starting Honeybee, but it certainly gave me more confidence when I left Sage and started Honeybee to be who I am and not to be a different person when I engage with clients or when I try and sell the services of the business. I'm not adopting a new persona to do that. I'm just being me. And that really helps.
That authenticity is so important. And I think from several of the conversations we've had across the series with a number of our guests, that move from trying to be somebody who people expect you to be, or rather who you think people expect you to be, into finding out who you really are and how you want to operate can be quite transformational. I think for some people it's an epiphany moment, for others it comes over time. Would you say that you feel more comfortable now when you're operating with clients than you ever have done? What comes next? Where's the next part of the journey for you?
I mean, absolutely. I feel more comfortable now than at any point in my career. In fact, I could probably extend that to my personal life as well. And you mentioned the word epiphany, and it did feel like that, actually. And I didn't expect it to, but it was kind of a moment that really just illuminated the fact that I'd spent the best part of 19 years pretending to be someone else, acting as such in certain scenarios at work. It wasn't all the time, it wasn't to everyone, but certainly in bigger meetings and high pressure situations, I'd adopt an approach that just wasn't really me, just to survive, really. And in terms of what happens next, for us at Honeybee, we've got some big expansion plans in 2026, not just from a client perspective, but we're developing a product which will help audit Google Ads in a very quick, efficient, and hopefully cheap way to open us up to a whole new audience who we wouldn't be working with in our current format. And that, as a learning curve, is incredibly steep. I've never developed a product. I've never put anything into market in this way. We are 75% of the way through it. And it's been an absolutely terrifying experience in a lot of ways, but also fantastic to be exposed to so many elements of running a business and starting a new offering that I would never have got through a corporate career path.
Can I ask, you mentioned this kind of new experience, things you haven't had to do before, haven't needed to do before. Marketing itself, it's so fast-paced, it's so ever-changing. What skills, from your point of view, what skills do you think marketers should be investing in now to stay relevant over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years?
Yeah, I feel like the stock answer here would be something around being AI literate. that feels boring, to be honest. I'm not underplaying the growing importance of AI tools in marketing, not by any means. And the monetization of AI platforms from an ads perspective will be fascinating, but I still think foundational skills are key. Commercial understanding, knowing your numbers is absolutely critical, alongside general data literacy and judgment. Ask the right questions, commit to a decision, and I think you'll be in a good place. That would be my recommendation. Yes, they'll be changing things. There'll be technology that is the flavor of the month. And by all means, stay attuned to that. It will be useful, but the foundation of that commercial understanding is what will help you succeed. And I wouldn't change that approach. Now, in 5 years, in 10 years, it's still going to be as important.
Knowing the basics, having, almost as a sporting metaphor, having good technique before you start trying anything more expansive or using a different piece of kit.
Absolutely. That's the perfect metaphor for this. Before you start the back heels in the penalty area, you just get that pass played 12 yards straight down the middle of the pitch. Perfect.
Well, before we get into the quickfire questions, we were talking about investing in yourself. That's a perfect segue now. We've got a note for our alumni listeners. If you're considering postgraduate study, and there are a couple of marketing courses there, Aston offers a 20% alumni scholarship across a range of programs, a practical way to upskill, stay competitive, keep moving forward in your career. We'll leave a link in the show notes so you can find out more if you're interested. But now, Kevin, back to you. We ask all our guests the same 2 quick-fire questions. Are you ready to give us some punchy answers?
Absolutely. Fire away.
If you could have anyone in the world, dead or alive, all throughout history, on your team, who would it be?
Wow. I mean, I'm not great at these questions as a caveat, but if we're talking about someone who could actually do an amazing marketing job, then I'm a huge fan of Professor Mark Ritson, who is an Australian marketing guru. I just absolutely love his approach. He's brilliant. For a slightly more off-the-wall selection, I'd go with Ross Brawn, the ex-F1 team principal. He's all about marginal gains and outthinking the opposition, building systems, and I find that approach is really applicable to marketing and can get you an awful long way if done properly.
Well, you're an alumnus and you're also being a fantastic guest here, so we'll let you have both.
Thank you.
I love both of those suggestions. I'm going to get you to cast your mind back to those Aston days back in the early 2000s. What is your favourite memory of your time at Aston?
Oh, I've got so many memories, most of which would render this podcast unfit for broadcast. So I was on campus quite recently towards the end of last year, and it's changed beyond recognition, but I actually absolutely loved living in the old towers and watching the rebuilding of the university happen around me in the early 2000s. It was a fantastic place to be. Also the pubs, I think there was roughly 100 pubs within a 1 mile radius of the campus when I first came to Aston. I think I probably did justice to 90 plus of those pubs in my first couple of years. So yeah, that was a very happy memory.
Can we get a shout out for which of the towers you were in?
I was Stafford Tower, floor 8 Stafford Tower, and I still remember the world's most powerful showers. Never before or never since have I been in a shower that so aggressively targets you as those Stafford Tower showers. So yeah, that's my abiding memory of the place before it kind of, I think it sank into the ground or before it was demolished.
Kevin, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. We've learned a huge amount. I can imagine Abby and any marketers who are listening will be furiously scribbling their notes out. Listeners, this is the final episode of Series 2. Exciting news. We will be back with Series 3. I just need to work out what I'm going to put on my rider for that. In the meantime, it's a big thank you from me to all our listeners and from everyone in the alumni team. We will be back soon. Aimee, I look forward to seeing you next time.
Looking forward to it, Geoff.
Thank you very much, Kev.
Thank you both. It's been a fantastic experience.